And while things are kicking on live here on the podcast channel, remember you can get all the shows on iHeart and Apple Podcast Station. If you just put in Bridges Live, you'll put on the show, and I think this show will be number 78. So if you go to iHeart Radio, you put in Bridges Live, you'll see the number 78, the show 78. There's a lot of shows on there. I've done over 400 shows with iHeart Radio, so they like me. So again, with paying the bills, and this goes out to Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and blah, blah, blah. So you can get on your social media. But more importantly, we like participation to listen, to ask questions. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box. I will see it. If we get a chance to ask or talk about it, I will always. You are part of the show. My co-host, Marylin Pierre, attorney at law. Marylin, happy Wednesday. It comes so fast.
Yes, it has. My goodness, it has been a week.
And we're waiting for our other co-host, Claudia. Is Claudia coming tonight, or is she busy?
I don't know. I thought she was coming.
Well,
we have people coming in, so I guess we could get started as they come in.
Good morning. Good evening. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. So nice to have you back. Hopefully you enjoyed this show. It's really interesting. I'm really looking forward to getting into the meat of it. Can I start introducing our special guest?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you. Mr. Frazier, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Stanford Frazier is a public defender in Prince George's County, and he lives in Largo, Maryland. Mm-hmm. He graduated from Howard University. Yay, you go, Bison. in 2013, where he studied history and community development. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 2016. We'll forgive you for that. He currently works as a public defender, a position he's held for the last 4 years. And he is also currently a candidate for state's attorney in Prince George's County, Maryland. The primary is June 28th, 2022. So please remember Mr. Stanford Frazier when you vote for state's attorney in Prince George's County. And of course, as a candidate myself, I could tell you, no matter where you live, please send money. So glad that you're here. Mr. Frazier, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself, or why you want to talk about juvenile justice, or whatever else you want to tell us about yourself?
No, thank you guys so much for having me on. I don't want to dominate too much of the space, but I really got involved in criminal legal issues trying to change the justice system when I was a student at Howard University. And it really started in 2011 on the day that Troy Davis was scheduled to be executed by the state of Georgia. And students across the country, but HBCU students, we organized. And what Howard did, we marched down on the White House. And I think from 12 to 7, we were outside of the White House protesting. The Supreme Court issued a stay of the execution, and we were like, woohoo. But by 11 p.m. that night, the stay was lifted, and the state of Georgia executed Troy Davis. And I think that disappointment from that moment is really what sparked my role in advocacy and trying to change the criminal legal system. So I'm glad to be here today.
So when we talk about criminal justice or the justice system, can you really define how you see the justice system? Because as my colleagues with Judge Claudia Barber and Marylin Pierre, it's a system, and a system has to be navigated. What do you think of the system in itself? I know you're now in it, but what do you think of the system?
I think we know the statistics. America has approximately 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's jail and prison population. If we come to the state of Maryland, there's some really poor racial inequalities. Statistically, you would notice that Black people make up about 31% of the state of Maryland, but make up 70% of the people in our prisons and jails. And it's worse with Black children. Black children make up 78% of the people in our juvenile jails. So those inequalities are some of the reasons why I want to become a public defender and some of the reasons why I want to run for state's attorney. And I hope to, discuss those policies today.
Thank you.
Love it. My. I'm excited for you, Mr. Fraser, to the extent that you want to be a public defender and then run for state's attorney suggests to me that you want to be intimately familiar with all of the problems on the defense end and bring them into the state's attorney's office so that our adjudicatory system or prosecutorial system looks more balanced. To me, that's a wonderful, thought-provoking and progressive idea. I think, to answer Dr. Dyer's question, I genuinely believe that the system suffers on so many levels, not just the systemic problems in how we have these poor statistics when it comes to high incarceration rates. It's about controlling the narrative and focusing on laser focused on facts, because the bottom line is that policing doesn't happen the same way in every community. And to that extent, that explains some of the systemic approaches to and the systemic racism that's in the judicial system and how people are prosecuted. You have half the population prosecuted for drugs, the other half of the population not being heavily prosecuted for drugs. It's just an uneven application of the law. Always has been. I mean, it's just always has been. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, because sometimes it's a crime and sometimes it's youthful exuberance. And you could tell whether it's a crime or whether it's youthful exuberance based on the amount of melanin that someone has in their skin many, many times. And we have to bring equity to the system. And I agree with Judge Barber. I love the fact that you are coming from the public defender's office. This is something that we usually don't see in the state's attorney. And a state attorney position is just so important in the justice system. And I wonder if you could tell us more about that, why it's so important and why it is that we should pay particular attention to people who are candidates for state's attorney.
No, that's a really good question. So the first thing I always remind people, state's attorney is the elected prosecutor of any jurisdiction. So there's a state's attorney for Prince George's County or Montgomery County or Baltimore City or Worcester or Dorchester, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And why is it important? Because they actually decide the policies of how we're prosecuting people, if we're prosecuting people for certain charges. I describe to people that most lawyers, we have an ethical code of conduct. And most lawyers, your ethical duty is to be a zealous advocate for your client, right? Fight really hard for your client, fight for your client's stated interests. But prosecutors and the state's attorney has a different ethical duty. Their ethical duty is to justice. And I think that's important, to justice. And what does that mean? For me, right, justice means fighting against those inequalities. For example, something as simple as, what are we doing with misdemeanor drug possession? Are we prosecuting it? Are we forcing people to go into diversion programs? Are we saying, actually, we don't think this is a priority and we want to use our resources, our limited police and prosecutorial resources on actual offenses that endanger the public safety? I think another thing that's actually a thing that's never talked about publicly is, what do elected prosecutors, what role do they play in shaping the law? In Maryland, there's something called the State's Attorneys Association. Mm-hmm. They're a lobby group of all the elected prosecutors across the state. And what you'll find out is in Annapolis, when there are bills to reform laws, they're sometimes opposed to these bills. So there's a bill to decriminalize misdemeanor possession of drugs. The State's Attorneys Association is opposed to it. There was a bill to completely ban no-knock warrants. The State's Attorneys Association was against it. Now that we got a reform, but they were against the bill to completely ban no-knock warrants. And here's something that's even more important. Based upon that reform, starting October 1st, 2021, all no-knock warrants have to be approved by the local state's attorney or their representative. So now your state's attorney in your jurisdiction has the power to actually ban no-knock warrants in your jurisdiction. So I think that's because, and that issue has become very, unfortunately, well known in the last year.
Yeah,
But there's
because,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
There's so many other dynamics to this. And I say that because I know for a fact in the federal jury system, I've never been called to jury duty in my entire life, and I'm in my 60s. Okay. So there's something laser focused about what's going on there. I remember in the police shooting and killing of Leroy Perry a few decades ago, his case was moved to a Western Maryland court, and the police officer was acquitted. The Leroy Perry was unarmed at the time. It happened in Anne Arundel County, and he was going to the trunk of his car to get a screwdriver to open it up because he couldn't open up the glove compartment to get his ID to the officer. So the officer supposedly mistook the screwdriver to be a gun and shot him dead. And to the extent that the issue was raised with the police officer in an unjustified shooting, he was acquitted. All you do is transfer the case to another venue, get the jury of people that looks like you, and then you get off. I mean, that same issue with Toey Sparrow's case in U.S. Federal District Court in Greenbelt, yeah. Or in I know it was in Maryland. I don't know if it was in Greenbelt or Baltimore, but the officer acquitted, all white jury, and there's something with that jury pool that we need to stay laser focused on to determine whether or not the powers are controlling who gets to serve on juries and what jurisdictions of the state participate in federal jury trials. So, I can say for a fact, my sister's never served on the federal jury in Maryland. I've never served on the federal jury in Maryland. My sister's older than me.
Never been asked.
Never been asked. Same thing with my parents who are now deceased. So, and they've been in this state since 1957. So, our brows should be red. And the problem is that if these injustices exist, the people, the powers that be get by with this. Mm-hmm. They get by with these inequities, these, these slights, these microaggressions, these micro assaults, these, unevenness in the application of the law. They just get by with it with no consequences. And that's what needs to change. We need to raise up Stanford Frasers all over the whole state so that they can do the right thing and you can have fairness and equity in this judicial system to make major changes.
Do you think?
I'm sorry.
Well, who has a question? Someone has a question.
Hi, everyone. I'm joining the conversation, but I'm taken with what Judge Barber said about the inequities that exist. Every time I hear the label justice system, I'm taken aback because there's no justice in the present day system. So I'm interested, and to answer her question, why she or her sister or Marylin weren't chosen, because you're too knowledgeable. They want someone who can be easily swayed by their argument. And if you think too much about what they've said and you said, that doesn't make sense, they don't want you on the jury. And also, as far as changing the system, it's interesting that because of the people that we elect have the power to change the system, it must be the system must be represented by the mindset of those people in power. Mm-hmm. So we need different types of people to make these decisions, So we need someone like Mr. Fraser to have a voice so he can start changing things.
But
I'm so happy that he's young, and he'll need all that energy and that fortitude to do it, because it's going to be a hard climb.
Miss Washington,
so I wish you all the luck.
Miss Washington, you kind of bring up a question that we bang our heads up against the people who are active. We bang our heads up against there's still not enough people voting. That is a head scratcher. You know, when Mr. Frazier talked about the percentage of the people that are in jail, if we just had the same amount of percentage to vote,
oh, sure.
I think it would change the amount of people who are in prison. So we don't get enough people to vote. We don't get enough neighbors to tell neighbors, why didn't you vote? Come vote with me. I don't know. I've been working in elections for a long time, and it's puzzling. So, Mr.
Maybe we should follow the example of Georgia and Arizona, the way they rallied the people together behind the cause. You have to educate them, and then you have to spur their spirit. You have to tell them this is unjust. And in order for us to change it, we have to vote.
So, well, I have heard from some people that they don't vote because they don't want to be called for jury duty. So, I mean, if you don't vote because you don't want to be called for jury duty, that's neither here nor there. But I do want to talk to Mr. Frazier about how he feels about juveniles in the so-called justice system.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. How do you feel about juveniles getting in there? How do you feel about a young child being found involved in a delinquent act? And what do you think about children being tried as adults? What do you think about children being given life without the possibility of parole? I know it's a lot of questions, but this is a very, very intensive topic, and there's just so much to cover, especially in light of Justice Kavanaugh's opinion recently.
Yep.
Taking us back a couple of steps. Who didn't expect that? So this is a really interesting topic. And I'm sorry, on top of Justice Kavanaugh's the decision that he wrote 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
On that topic. And then we have Governor Hogan, who vetoed the law that was passed by the legislatures, which was going to take away the judge's right to sentence a juvenile to life without the possibility of parole. So I know it's a lot, but I know you could do it, because after all, you are a bison. And just like, Joni said, you are young. And I would like to say you are young, gifted, and Black. So Nina Simone has all her hopes in you, and you could answer all those questions.
Absolutely.
All right. That was a lot. That was a lot of questions. I hope I can address all of them. I'm against juveniles being charged as an adult.
Mm-hmm. And why is that?
I think that the data is pretty clear that there are a couple things. The Supreme Court, speaking of Supreme Court decisions, I think back in the 70s or maybe the 80s, has an opinion where they say the main purpose of the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system for adults, actually isn't punishment. There are plenty of purposes. My fault. I apologize. I'm going to slow down. Isn't rehabilitation. There are plenty of purposes. Rehabilitation is one of them. But that's not the main purpose. But for the juvenile justice system, the main purpose is rehabilitation. We know that when kids are in the juvenile justice system, those courts are designed to have more services and rehabilitation, right, facilities. Versus when they're in the adult system, there's actually studies that show charging kids as an adult, putting them in adult jails, leads to not only trauma, but actually increases recidivism. What does that mean? It actually makes them more likely to reoffend in the future. And then the third point would be that there's studies that the child brain, right, the frontal lobe, that's the part of your brain that helps with decision making, isn't fully developed until you're 21 or even 25. So children don't have the same thinking and same decision making ability as adults, right? The chapter, who you are at 15 is going to be different than who you are at 30 and who you are at 45. And when we prosecute children as adults, we take away that opportunity for growth. I think one one thing I like to talking about voting and what people don't know is that in Maryland, there actually isn't a minimum age to prosecute a child. I'm saying it again, there isn't a minimum age to put a child through the legal system.
I've seen 7-year-old with handcuffs and leg shackles. I'm like, oh my gosh, is this really necessary? Wow.
It can be painful, and it's painful to see. It's painful to see those type of things. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about life without the possibility of parole, I can tell you, I don't believe in that for anyone, especially not children. I believe, everyone has the possibility to grow and to rehabilitate. And when you take away just that possibility, you're saying that human beings are irredeemable.
So the pushback you're going to get, Mr. Frazier, is there an adult crime that a child can do that you still would prosecute them as an adult? And I thoroughly agree with your understanding of the brain, because I can go crazy and talk about the neuroscience of it. But when you talk about to the community who is put on their heels of fear-based information, they talk about how a young child is shot someone, they should be prosecuted by the crime they commit. How do you answer that question to the community that just flat out, and the community we're talking about isn't a black community majority. It's a white community that says, try them and throw them away.
Well, wasn't there in the District of Columbia a recent case involving a 12-year-old who shot a 13-year-old or vice versa? That was recent, within the last month or so.
Actually, unfortunately, that tragic case happened here in Prince George's County.
Oh, okay, that's right. Okay, got the wrong county there.
Wow. I'll say a couple of things. So a child can't commit an adult crime. There are children and there are adults. They're not adult crimes and children crimes. That's just how I feel. I'm proud of that, and that's the campaign I'm running, and that's the message I'm going to tell the voters. I think the second thing to look at is, like, what do we mean by redemption? Mm-hmm. We can protect the public safety. We have a juvenile legal system that charges can be made in the juvenile legal system. It can be adjudicated there, and then the judges can make decisions, prosecutors and defense attorneys can make decisions, and if someone's found delinquent, they can be provided services aimed at rehabilitation, which is different than the adult system. And if we want to reduce recidivism, if we want to make our community safer, then the children that actually need those services, we want them to get those services.
And I like it. Well, first of all, I know you could have answered all those questions I threw at you all at once. You were excellent. And second of all, I want to take a moment to talk to the non-lawyers here, not to talk down to anyone. We just want to make sure that we're speaking the same language. What Mr. Frazier said, and you said it really fast, which is why I'm slowing it down, is he talked about delinquent acts. Juveniles, which is identified in the state of Maryland as children under 18 years old. So juveniles who commit what would be called a crime if an adult were to do it. If a juvenile does it, it's called a delinquent act. So, well, I should say if a juvenile does it and the juvenile is being tried as a juvenile, it's called a delinquent act. It's not called a crime. And when and the juvenile under that situation is not convicted of a crime, the juvenile is found involved or not involved in that delinquent act. And it makes a huge difference to that juvenile, because juvenile records are sealed and only under certain circumstances are they open to the general public. However, when a juvenile is tried as an adult and is convicted of a crime, then that record is open for anybody to see, well, anybody who's got internet access to see. And that's why Mr. Frazier says that limits. I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak for you. Sorry, you could speak for yourself. Go ahead, Mr. Frazier.
It limits. We know just being charged with a crime can make you lose a job. It can make you get evicted from your home. It can prevent you from qualifying for financial aid for post-secondary education. Mm-hmm. It can prevent you from getting certain professional licenses. So when we're talking about that adult conviction on a child, you're talking about lifelong consequences that, one, is going to impact them negatively, but also impact the community negatively. You have individuals that are struggling to get housing, struggling to get jobs, struggling to get education. I think you said something before, Marylin, about how Governor Hogan vetoed the bill to ban juvenile life without parole. But I want to mention that the legislature actually overrode that veto.
Oh, I haven't. Okay, good. I'm really glad to hear that, because that is so important, because especially in light of Justice Kavanaugh's opinion recently about how you had to find that the person who was, the juvenile who was convicted had to be incorrigible. Did not have to make that finding. You just had to consider his youth. Oh, okay. Well, he's 7. Okay, we considered his youth. We could give him life without the possibility of parole. So I'm really glad to hear that. Thank you for catching me.
Mr. Fraser, I have a question. Are you currently running for state's attorney?
I am currently running. So I announced the filing deadline is February next year. So no one's technically filed yet. I also have not filed yet. One, from like a personal thing, people like to get the picture of them filing for running for office, and a lot of that is still virtual. Hopefully by the summer or even by like the fall, you can actually go in person to your board of election and file.
Okay, so which county?
Prince George.
In Prince George's County.
In Prince George's County, okay.
And just so you could educate us, you would file in the county or would you file in the state?
I would file in the county. This is for anyone doing politics. You have your candidate committee, so that's friends of, or a committee to elect, is registered with the state. And you have to have a chairman and a treasurer. And then once you get that filing, there are certain requirements depending on your position. So for countywide, this requirements, state's attorney has to fill out a financial ethics disclosure, your candidate statement, filing fee, and then you have to be a barred attorney in Maryland for at least 1 year.
And don't own a house in Florida. We don't want to hear that noise again, because if you own a house in Florida, you will be raked over the coals. I'm telling you.
Look, I wanted to ask something. I know that you all have been talking about juveniles, but one area that I feel that is a problem, and I think you'd call them young adults. I noticed that the state's attorney's office, at least in Anne Arundel County, I don't know what they do in PG, but they tend to stack charges on young adults in particular. So, for example, there was somebody that I was aware of in my family who got charged, and if they had found him guilty of everything they charged him with, he'd been in jail for over 140 years or something crazy. So my question is there a different way that we should be looking at charging young adults? Because, just because you just turned 18 doesn't mean that you're any more mature than you were when you were at 17 and almost 18. How can we deal with that, those kind of issues and the realities of the limitations of the brain and processing and all that kind of stuff?
Okay. Can I add to that? Because I noticed in many state's attorneys' offices, that's what they do. They charge the person with several counts of a whole bunch of things, and then when I guess during the negotiation process, they're like, "Oh, you know what? We'll drop off these two if you plead guilty to these two." When there should not have been 4 to begin with.
Exactly.
And so the lawyer says to the defendant, "Hey, you have 70 years instead of 140 years. So why don't you plead guilty, so that way you're not opening yourself up to 140? But there should not have been 140 to begin with."
Exactly.
So how do you feel about that process?
No, that's important. I think you mentioned there were 2 things mentioned. One, I think, could be changed through the state's attorney's office, and the other would have to be changed maybe at the statewide level. I think it's Connecticut, but I'm not 100% sure, wanted to model after Europe, because in Europe, a lot of places, someone's eligible for the juvenile justice system up until the age of 21, recognizing that young adult, sometimes called emerging adult population. I think Connecticut just passed legislation, at least up to 19 or 20, trying to create a system capturing that population, but there's not that many states in the United States.
Yeah, that's true. There are a couple of states that are moving towards that, and I think that's because of the scientists are basically saying, hey, just because you're 18 doesn't mean that your brain is fully formed, and we need to take that into consideration before.
So then why aren't they moving it to like 26 or something? I thought it was much older than that when your brain
25
actually. What is it, Paul?
25.
Yeah, why aren't they moving it to 25 then? Doesn't make any sense.
Well, we are voters. We are people who could talk to our legislatures and say, hey, this is what we want, just like the people in Connecticut and some other states are doing that as well. There's a group that's being called Emerging Adults that because they are over 18, for instance, in the state of Maryland, they automatically are tried as adults. But then they're 18 to 24, so that means that their brains are not fully formed yet. So they basically fall into that donut area that's very, very harmful to them. But as we said, we are voters. We could speak to our legislatures and say, this is what we want. We want you to move with the science. Mr. Frazier?
No, exactly. Let's take that Connecticut bill. Go to
exactly.
mplx.com or .net, find out who your people are and say, hey, I saw this Connecticut bill. Can you introduce this here in Maryland? See what your elected official says.
So, Mr. Frazier, and I still have to say to everyone who's listening and anyone who does anything, I'm glad you're voting. I'm glad you're running. I'm glad anyone who runs to help change the system, because you can't change the system by watching it. So with that being said, there's a lot of what you call security resource officers in schools, right? And they think that is the pathway to the prison. So they arrest them in schools and they pipeline them right into the jails. What do you think about the school
to prison pipeline?
Yeah.
So we're getting big. I want to start large and then get small.
Sure.
Well, police officers are armed government employees trained in force, including deadly force. I don't believe those officers should be in our schools, right? I don't believe those officers should go to nonviolent calls for service, such as mental health calls or substance abuse calls. And I think we need to remove those type of officers. We can enforce traffic without using armed government employees trained in lethal force. So that's my big picture view of policing and what roles they should or should not have in our society, and what I would advocate for. The second part is what we're talking about in schools. When we talk about the school to prison pipeline, I think there's two things. One, when we charge kids as adults, to me, that is the school to prison pipeline. But I think the second thing is there was activities that even back when I was younger, where this is a school suspension, or not even a school suspension, maybe it's an in-house suspension, maybe it's detention and things of that nature, that now end up in the criminal legal system that I don't think belong there. And we need to start having a conversation of what acts by children are, hey, sometimes children do wrong, you get punished. When I did wrong, I was punished as a child. But that doesn't mean that punishment needs to involve the criminal legal system.
What are some of those things that are
I think Evangelist Minor might want to say something.
I think, Michelle Minor, you're muted, but I know you're trying to say something. My apologies, Doctor.
Oh, no. Sorry, Dr. Dyer.
Yes, Dr. Dyer mentioned as far as people not voting, and Mr. Frazier mentioned the ratio. And the ratio in the prison system is extremely high. And you have people in this prison system who have felony charges for marijuana. Do you think that there would be a law to release these people who have felony charges for marijuana distribution, being that marijuana is legal in some states? And I don't know if I'm correct or not, but I thought a person who had a felony charge was not able to vote. And Mr. Frazier, I would like for you to explain no, not warrant. And Judge Barber, if you would elaborate on laser focus meaning.
Yeah. Man, all these multi-part questions. I got to remember things. I think
write them down.
I know. I'm going to start. Usually in court, I'm writing like a menace, but I don't want to be looking down on this video call. So you asked a lot of things. So there was a bill this past year to legalize marijuana. It didn't pass in Maryland. I think part of the bill was to allow for expungement for people that have possession, any level of possession. But one of the things that some legislators brought up was, no, we should include distribution. But I'm going to be honest with you, in the negotiation, I don't know if that I don't think they got into the bill, but people were fighting for it to get into the bill. Now, some states, when they passed marijuana, there was automatic expungement. But in the state of Maryland, there's been arguments that the way our case search Maryland works, they don't technologically, it's actually not possible to do automatic expungement. And people are fighting against that as well. I think if you talk to a legislator in Maryland, say, oh yeah, of course I support legal marijuana, but then there's a but afterwards. Because of X, Y, and Z reasons, we still haven't passed it here. So speaking to the voting, I think us as the people just have to apply more and more pressure. It's going to happen. It's going to depend on when. I mean, this is, in New York, it only passed because their governor is going through every single scandal in the book. You can even make an argument in Virginia. So that political pressure finally created the conditions to pass something that was very popular amongst the people. I want to get to your second part. I think I didn't answer all your marijuana questions, but I want to get especially to the no-knock warrant. So usually for a warrant, when officers come to your home, they knock. You probably heard the joke, hey, why you knock on my door like you're the police? Right? That loud, where the police knock. A no-knock warrant is when they don't do that, and then they just come into your home trying to look for the contraband, right? I don't know, maybe a firearm, maybe drugs. The problem is, if you're in your house sleeping and it's 1 a.m. and someone barges into your door, you don't know who it is, you probably think you're actually the victim of a crime. And then, because this is the United States of America, we have the Second Amendment, you have the right to protect your property, protect your home. So you have firearms, the police might have firearms, and it creates conditions that are dangerous for police officers and people in their homes themselves.
Okay, before you went further, my son, who was unarmed, and he was murdered by Sheriff Deputy Kendall Wade. And he stopped my son. And my son's question to him was, why are you doing this? There is no warrant for my arrest. I have not committed no crime. And he commanded my son to put his hands up. And my son asked him again. No, he stated again, there is no warrant. And Sheriff Wade shot him. And of course, my son was dead.
I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry for your loss. I've been speaking to people. I've heard about that particular sheriff. I think this is going to another thing. When you give me that type of story, I'm sorry for your loss, and I can't do anything to correct what happened to your family.
No, but when I heard you mention no, not warrant, and this was my son's, statement to Wade, there is no warrant for my arrest. I haven't committed no crime.
Yeah, I can address that tangentially, but I don't want to overpromise. But I think there's two important things. In Prince George's County, just a month ago, local reporter Tracy Wilkins talked to the state's attorney and admitted she has a list of officers with credibility issues. That there's 28 officers on this list, and that 15 of them she won't call as witnesses in court. When I heard of this, I realized that sounds like half the list can still be called as witnesses. But what are credibility issues? Sometimes you can Google an officer or a sheriff and you'll find out maybe they shot and killed an unarmed person in Prince George's County. Maybe they've been accused multiple times of excessive force or multiple times of racial bias. And those types of information need to be disclosed, right? If you have an officer who multiple times have pulled someone out of the car, beat on them, and then accused the person of assault on a law enforcement officer, and your client's being accused of assault on a law enforcement officer, that's relevant. But unfortunately, in Prince George's County and in other counties, when defense attorneys request those records, two people come to court and say you don't have a right to those records. Someone from the county attorney's office, representing the police union, and the prosecutor, the assistant state's attorney assigned to that case. But the state's attorney's job is not to protect officer misconduct, to hide officer misconduct, it's to pursue justice. So in my office, we're going to voluntarily release those records. We're going to make that list public, and we're going to no longer fight to hide officer misconduct because, and I'm going full circle, but I'm about to wrap up. If you looked at the Derek Chauvin who killed George Floyd, he had 22 complaints or internal affairs investigations in him. If those records were released in all of his cases, he wouldn't have been on the street, he wouldn't have been able to still arrest people, and he wouldn't have been in the community harming our community. I'm sorry, I can't bring back what happened to your family, but I can promise that I'm not going to protect these bad officers, and hopefully we can stop them before they harm more community members. I know that's a little solace, but that's what I can do as state's attorney.
And this was not Wade's first offense using his firearm.
So, yeah. I'm so sorry. And if this happened with him, if those records were released and no longer fought to hide those records, then maybe we could have got him off the street before he continued to harm our community. I'm so sorry for your loss.
You know,
Because
So
there.
why a law like Anton's law is so important, and I'm so glad that the legislatures were able to pass it. That way, information about a police officer's criminal record gets to, well, we get to know a lot more than we know now about an officer's personnel history.
We know there's a lot of children, people, adults, human lives that are lost by misconduct. In many employments, but when it comes to the service of the community, and it's a misconduct that loses a life, it affects us all so tragically. Because if something happens at a factory that I don't work at and people get hurt, that is sad. But if something happens to a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, a sister, a brother, that could be me. And I too drive a car. I too have a home. So we say to ourselves, I too can be that person. And then we have family members. I have family members. I too have lost a family member to excessive force. Being a state's attorney, is it your duty to prosecute misconducts, or is it something that you look forward to do as a state's attorney to prosecute misconducts? Which one is it?
I think if it's misconduct of government officials, especially government officials that are armed and trained in force, then we need to protect the public safety and hold those people accountable. But I was saying before, my goal is to stop it before the misconduct happens. And by not hiding misconduct in court, by publicly releasing the list of officers with credibility issues, the community is aware of who these officers are, and then we can put pressure on the chief. We can put pressure on elected officials saying, wait, why are these officers still in our community? With Anton law passed, we can then file Maryland Public Information Act request and find out, hey, what's going on with this officer? And then once we get those records, go back to the chief or go back to our elected officials and say, hey, why is this officer still on the force? So that we can stop this action before it happens. I think in Prince George's County, there's a lawsuit against the police department for bias and disciplinary bias in hiring and firing. And I don't have the exact number in front of me, but what they find is most of the use of force is done by a relatively small minority of the officers. So if we can cut that, I mean, it's large because we have a large police department, but it's relatively still a minority of the officers. If we can remove those officers, if we can remove that misconduct from the force, then we can have a police department that without that misconduct, and hopefully stop that damage before community members are harmed.
But can the
Just
community...
two things. Oh, I'm so sorry, Joni. You go, because I interrupted you last time. Go ahead.
What can we as a community, how can we address police misconduct? Do we write letters? Do we march? Protest? Do we have peaceful protests? I know you said we vote and we get the right people in office, but what else can we do collectively?
I actually want to answer that. The captain, the chief, is an elected official. If there's a misconduct on the police force, then we need to hold the chief accountable that he or she are not doing their job.
Let me just correct you for just one moment. Sorry about that, Dr. Dyer.
Yeah.
The police chief is not elected. The county executive who appoints the
chief.
Police chief is elected. So if you want to hold the police chief accountable by an elected official, then it's the mayor who, if it's
the sheriff is elected.
It's the county executive if it's the county. Yeah, so that's who you would hold accountable. And I agree with you. I mean, with the Chauvin case, for instance, I think we should hold the supervisor accountable as well, because had the supervisor done his or her job, Chauvin would not have been walking around doing what he's doing. And I personally think he would not have been that casual. I mean, the way he was so casual, it's like, oh, it's just a day in the park for me. And then you could tell that they were they were not, his supervisors were not doing their jobs, because when he got back to the station, it was just another day for everybody there. It wasn't, oh, by the way, this, heinous thing just happened and we should all be running around like our hair was on fire. It was just like, oh, okay, he just finished his shift.
They cut you off.
But in this case, with my son, State Attorney Alsabrook, Sheriff Hines is Wade's supervisor. The state attorney, Angela Alsabrook, was the state attorney at that time. And she covered for Sheriff Hines to be not involved in litigation.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm sorry, I'm answering Evangelist Minor's question because I'm more familiar with her situation than you are. I'll give you a chance to do that. I think in your situation, because she was the state's attorney at the time and she did not do what you think she should have done, and now she's the county executive, and as I stated before, the county executive is the one who is responsible for hiring the police chief, and the police chief is then the one who is responsible for supervising the police officers.
And not only that, Sheriff Deputy Hyde was a candidate in 2006, I believe, to run for sheriff, and Wade was running against him. And Sheriff Hyde was elected as the sheriff, which he never reprimanded Wade. Alsabrook never reprimanded Hyde nor Wade.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, the sheriff does get elected, but the police chief does not. And I forgot, was it a sheriff who killed your son, or was it a police officer?
Well, Wade. I don't know if he's sheriff deputy Kenneth Wade.
Okay, so since he's a sheriff deputy, then yes, the sheriff does get elected. Oh, Mr. Gogan, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Now, I just want to give clarity. Wade is a deputy sheriff, a rookie deputy sheriff at the time. Sheriff Hyde is the elected sheriff. During the 2018. Wade ran against Hyde, but Wade's on.
Well, your connection's really bad. We missed a lot of it, Mr. Gogan, because your connection was really bad.
Oh,
hello?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Much better.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I was just giving the explanation of Sheriff Hyde being the elected official, and Kendall Wade is a deputy sheriff. Wade ran for sheriff, supposedly running against his boss, Melvin Hyde. But
thank you for reminding me. Yes. So because of that,
that's all I was just trying to get clarity.
Sorry. Well, the sheriff is elected, and so since the sheriff is elected, the deputy sheriffs aren't, but the sheriff is in charge of the deputy sheriffs. I wonder if you remembered what one of the suggestions was from last week for you to go to the Freedom of Information Act to get information about what happened to your son, a copy of the 911 phone call and all that kind of stuff. Because I think once you get that information, it will be easier to say to whoever it is who needs to address this issue that, hey, this is the information right there. This is what was said. And I don't see any reason why this person should not be tried.
Mr. Frazier, do you think it's possible to help Miss Minor to get that 911 call for her son in Prince George's?
Public defenders request and subpoena 911 calls all the time, so I have experience with that. And if we talk on the side, maybe it's a possibility. I don't have enough information, so I don't want to commit to something with limited information. But we have gotten 911 calls in the past, and I'm willing to try or at least explore that.
So please,
I think Mr. Gogan could get the two of you together.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, Evangelist Minor, just to go back very, very far, I know you asked whether a felon could vote in Maryland, and I was looking for the exact language because I wanted the exact language, and I found it. And it says that in Maryland, in order for you to vote, you must, quote, not have been convicted of a felony, or if you have completed serving a court-ordered sentence of imprisonment. So basically, if you're not in prison, you could vote.
You can vote.
So you could be a felon, meaning that you have a criminal record for committing a felony. But if you have served your prison sentence and you are now outside, you can vote.
Okay.
And also, even if you're a felon and they pick you up on another charge, if you and you're in jail for that charge because you can't make bail or something like that, if you have not been convicted of that second charge, you could also vote. And that's very important to explain to people because sometimes, sometimes they don't know, and you need to tell people that they have a right to vote. But I understand Holly's point as well in terms of that poor woman who thought she was she was eligible to vote and who voted and was imprisoned for 5 years, I think, which that was not Maryland. So I don't know what the law in that state was. Holly, do you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to say she might well have been confused because she knew that other people could. She, it wasn't something that someone couldn't make a mistake about,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Mr. Frazier, before we got a little bit of time left, we know that there's been some talk about low-level crimes and not prosecuting low-level crimes. And it seems to be a topic on several of many broadcast stations and the complaint of not prosecuting low-level crimes. First, how do you distinguish the difference between a low-level crime and to not prosecute it?
Yeah, so the best example I use in Prince George's County is that here, you're not allowed to own a pit bull. But not only are you not allowed to own a pit bull, owning a pit bull is actually a misdemeanor, punishable up to 6 months in jail. I think not many people or no one on this call think you should be caged or even threaten to be caged because you give a dog a loving home, right?
Right.
So that's an example of something that's a crime, but we shouldn't prosecute that crime. And thankfully, I haven't gotten a lot of those cases, but in my time as a public defender, I've gotten 1 or 2 of those cases. So when we're talking about things that are low-level crimes and how do we distinguish, we have a conversation as a community about what do we think should be criminalized and what we think should not be criminalized. My list includes stuff as disorderly conduct, being loud outside. I don't believe that's a crime. Something as simple as people that are homeless sometimes get charged with trespass. I don't believe that should be a crime. So we're going to have our list of misdemeanors. And I think, the pit bull example, that's probably the easy examples. Maybe the disorderly conduct and trespass are not as easy, but easier examples. And then there might be some hard cases in the middle. False statement to a police officer, but usually just lying about your name. I think that's another case type of charge that I wouldn't want to prosecute. And then you get on and on. And we have like the harder cases. And then we have the easy case on the other end where obviously homicide, that's a serious crime. We're going to prosecute that. We're going to ensure the public safety on those types of counts. So I think that's how we have that conversation, and that's how we decide.
I think that's a great point. Mm-hmm. I do want to add one little disagreement that I have with you, and I think that you're going to agree with me. I think it's just a matter of specificity. What I mean by that is you said that police officers shouldn't go on certain calls, like the mental health calls. I think that the police officers should be there as well, but they should take a secondary role. And the reason why I think that they should be there is because sometimes those things do turn violent. I know that I do a lot of abuse and neglect cases, and when those kids are the social workers used to go to the homes to remove the kids by themselves, and many of them got hurt and injured because the parents were fighting them because they didn't want their children removed. I mean, we could just imagine that. So the police officers started going with the social workers to remove the children. So the social workers would be the front person. removing the children, and the police officers would just be there but stand behind. And they would get involved if things got violent, but they weren't the ones saying, you need to, give those children up and things like that. So I do think that there's certain roles that we could use police officers for. And of course, I do think you need a certain personality to be a police officer. But I do think sometimes they are needed in the situations where there are mental health issues as well as children removal. In terms of resource officers, that that is difficult because I don't see a role for them as being resource officers, and the statistics show that they are fueling the school to prison pipeline, so that's not helpful either. But I don't know if you want to respond to that.
I would love to respond to that. I think similar to the other example, there are easier cases, middle cases, and harder cases. So when I mean that there are nonviolent calls for service that we don't need police officers, the easiest one is cat stuck in a tree, right? Mm-hmm. And then you might get a call, someone's been asleep at this gas station for 2 hours in their car, I'm worried about them. There's not a crime being committed. Maybe there's an example of, someone's hunched over on the sidewalk, I think they're overdosing. That's something maybe we want to send a nurse and a social worker, but we don't need police officers. But then there may be situations that you described, where as a community we have that conversation, and on balance, I think maybe on balance community members will say, okay, no, I think I agree with Marylin more than Stanford. Let's send social workers as well as officers. Social workers take the lead, but maybe officers in the back. And then there's more aggressive calls where no, we definitely want officers there and not mental health professionals or other type of health professionals.
Exactly.
Go ahead, Miss Vicki Gibson. Do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, and he may have addressed this, but I was just curious what made him decide to switch from being the public defender to the state's attorney. Just curious.
Good question.
So the one story I tell is that my wife is a public defender. She did juveniles for 2.5 years, and now she's doing appellate. And she had a case where in Maryland, when a kid is charged as an adult, every child charged as an adult has a right to a transfer hearing where you want your case moved back down to juvenile court.
And I want to interject right there. That's why judges are so important, because it is a circuit court judge that makes the decision as to whether or not a child should be tried as an adult.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So in her case, the prosecutor assigned said, no, we'll consent. We'll agree to transfer. Woohoo. But only if my wife's client pled guilty. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think any child belongs in adult court, but I especially don't believe that decision should depend on whether they waive their constitutional right to a trial. We brought this issue to the incumbent. To her credit, she listened to us. But to this day, that practice still occurs. Mm-hmm. And I remember leaving that conversation thinking, I was shaking my head and I said, if I was state's attorney, that wouldn't happen. And then I said, well, why not go and try to become state's attorney so that won't happen? And there's little examples like that all the time in my career as a public defender that really motivated me to run for this position.
That's very good. It circled back to what Judge Gibson asked earlier in reference to the overcharging. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Anybody else has a question? Judge Gibson, do you want to follow up?
No, I think he's done an excellent job at, kind of talking about what his interests and concerns are. So good luck with your effort there.
And I think people had a question of where do we have these conversations? I think we can have these conversations here, because this is why we have the show, You Be the Judge. It is to have these conversations with people like you and the people that are in our community and people like Mrs. Minor to hear their story, because there is a legal side and there's an emotional side. And if we don't hear the information, it is hard for us citizens to understand how things are run and how things are processed. Because I think the civilian people misunderstand how the process is. And that's where we get hostile with an emotional discourse. Now that we have shows like this that gives information, I think people can sit back and go, oh, I just didn't know. So thank you so much.
I have a question for Mr. Fraser. You were talking about the juvenile justice system and rehabilitation. How does that system rehabilitate the youth as opposed to, I know the prison system does it, but how does the juvenile prison system rehabilitate the youth?
Yeah, it's a couple of methods. There's counseling services, there's restorative justice services, there's behavioral health therapy and things of that nature. There's also the juvenile system, juvenile jails have access to make sure that you actually can still get an education, get a GED. And they're then, and some of them are trying to create new partnerships with their local community college because of the Hope Scholarship, where if you graduate from high school in Maryland, you can basically go to community college for free. So those are some of the ways that they help with rehabilitation.
That's great. Those programs are really necessary. But I'm also taken with the fact that they say when the warden goes home, the people who are really in charge take over. And these people want to perpetuate crime. They don't want the juvenile to improve himself and leave the system. Okay, so what do we do about that?
I apologize. When you say these people, who you?
I'm talking about the criminals who have been there so long that they own the prison, and they want to recruit the new people coming in.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why it's really important for the distinction between juvenile system and the adult system. Because when we send kids to that adult jail, they are being mentored by those old people who have criminal records that are possibly in the prison. They're being mentored by those individuals.
Absolutely.
And that's why the data shows actually sending them to adult jail actually most of the times increases the likelihood of them being arrested or them being involved in the criminal legal system in the future. Versus in the juvenile jail, they're less likely. So I think
why
that's
are they less likely when you still have the same mindset in the juvenile system?
Well, I think, like I was saying before, the mindset is still other juveniles, other kids whose brains aren't fully developed that can be aged out of some of these behaviors, right, that are bad behaviors. And they're also receiving those same counseling services, those same behavioral health therapies that the people that are newly arrested or newly incarcerated are receiving.
Well, thank you.
And also, I'm sorry, Joni, just 1 second. And also, they haven't learned as much about ways to get around the system and use the system in things of that sort. And in addition to that, if they were found guilty of an adult crime, they would be punished. The intent would be to punish them, which means that they would go into an adult jail. And many adult prisons just put juveniles in a separate place, and a lot of them are actually in isolation for their own safety, quote unquote, and that's not good for their mental health either. So I'm done. Joni, you could finish your question. Sorry.
Oh, I'm finished. I'm just wanted to put a little focus on the fact that I want the juvenile prison system to be all that Mr. Frazier says hopes that it should be. And you have to worry about the person who's waiting for the warden to go home so that he can build his empire, let's say. To recruit people who are vulnerable because the warden has gone home. And because the correction officers that supposedly police the facility are under the thumb of perhaps the prisoner who's in control.
We thank you, Mr. Frazier, for coming on You Be the Judge. We can talk more throughout the evening, but we have a show. This is an hour long, and thank you for all your questions and comments, and please join us next week. We're here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. You Be the Judge. Myself, Dr. Paul, and Marylin, Pierre, and Judge Claudia, Barber. I also like to want to do a little PSA. Remember that we have a sickle cell anemia problem. We need Black donors, so spread the word. Find out where your local blood drive is. If you don't know where your local blood drives are that's collecting blood, please contact me on my email, and I will guide you to the nearest blood drive, because we are losing patients that have sickle cell because they're not getting enough black blood, and not enough black donors are donating their blood. It is, again, one of those small percentage of things that black people do. We don't know why, but we need you to get out there to donate blood. It's sad that people die just because someone doesn't want to donate or don't know that they can donate or should donate. So, Mr. Frazier, before we take off, would you like to say anything before we take off? And I, again, want to say thank you.
Honestly, I just want to thank you guys for listening to me, and thank you guys for inviting me. It's been a really great conversation. There were some tough questions, but I really appreciate it.
Mr. David, you have a question?
I think that's an applause.
No, sir. I was just applauding. I appreciate this. It was a great discussion.
Please join us next week, Wednesday, 6 p.m., and use your same link. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night. Please be safe, be happy, and love and share, and get out and be active. Please.
Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you, Joni. That was a great topic.
Excellent. It was